Hey, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you. I'm the director of the Expanding Prosperity Impact Collaborative, otherwise known as EPIC for short, and also the director of Insights and Evidence with the Financial Security Program here at the Aspen Institute. As I mentioned, today's event is being live streamed and we'll be tweeting from @AspenFSP, so we encourage all of you to join the conversation using the hashtags housing affordability and also Aspen EPIC. And we do ask folks in the room here to please silence their phones. So today we'll be sharing what we've learned from a year of research into housing unaffordability and instability. Who's impacted, why it matters, and what's causing these challenges. We've spent a year working with many brilliant people from our EPIC advisory group, some of whom are here today, and all the other generous experts who've really shaped our view of those issues. And today we're also joined by a fantastic group of leaders who are taking bold action to address these challenges in their communities. And something that I think is really exciting is some of them are not the usual suspects. So I think that'll be really interesting and inspiring for you guys to hear about. None of this work would be possible without the incredible work of the whole Financial Security Program team, those brilliant and generous EPIC Housing Advisory Group members and other experts who work with us, and of course, our core EPIC funders, to whom we extend our warmest thanks: MetLife Foundation, the Prudential Foundation, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the podium Ida Rademacher, Vice President of the Aspen Institute and Executive Director of the Financial Security Program. She'll frame the afternoon for us, walk us through the agenda, and provide some opening remarks. Thanks, Ida.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. And where do I look when the live stream? Is that there? Hi, live stream, folks. We have tons of people that have been emailing saying they're going to watch from around the country. So I am delighted to be here with all of you. And I got to spend a little bit of time before this in the green room with our speakers. And to Genevieve's point, I am happy to say that when we think about housing, we often chalk it up to a couple of zip codes where people really know the story. None of those zip codes are represented in the panel today. You're going to be happy to hear from people in the middle of the country really grappling with this problem in broad ways. So it's going to be very exciting. Genevieve said that I lead the Financial Security Program. Mainly they lead me, and that's great. And just for those of you, because housing is not a normal focus area for the Aspen Institute. So for those of you who are new to Aspen and our events, welcome. I would say most people are familiar with some part of the Aspen Institute's work, but we are actually an organization that's been around since 1949. We're a global nonprofit committed to realizing a free, just, and equitable society. We really focus on driving change, and I think that's an important thing to think about through dialogue, through leadership, through action to help solve the most critical challenges facing society. And we work in the United States and around the world with a whole network of partners. Within that critical challenge framework, there's few things in the news today more frequently or more disturbingly than growing levels of inequality and financial instability in U.S. households, despite the longest economic expansion in U.S. history. And to that end, within the Aspen Institute, the Financial Security Program is dedicated to illuminating and solving the most critical financial challenges, really understanding from a household's point of view what is making it hard for them to contribute as producers, not just consumers in the economy, to contribute to economic growth, to benefit from that growth. We really look at financial challenges as some of the bedrock issues that are sizable but solvable, and that together with real leadership, we can take these on, we can prioritize them, and we can solve them. One of the most impactful tools in our toolbox at Aspen FSP has been the Expanding Prosperity Impact Collaborative, EPIC, that Genevieve talked about. This is a first of its kind initiative in the world of consumer finance. It brings together a wide cross-section of experts from, again, geographically, academia, government, industry, nonprofits. We take on one issue at a time. We go deep on it for 2 years through an entire cycle of synthesizing and translating research, really putting that into, so what are the dimensions and drivers of the problem, and how do we solve them? Then we create frameworks for solutions, and then we really do an exquisite job, I think, with an acceleration process that equips leaders with new tools and new networks and new resources to take challenges that we might have known existed, but we didn't have maybe the right coalitions of individuals prioritizing that together and working in new ways. So Aspen's platform is open for business on financial challenges, and the one that we are taking on and that you're here to talk about today is housing affordability and stability. About 18 months ago, when we decided what the next EPIC issue would be, we take on that as a very methodical process. We surveyed the thousands of people in our network, and it was interesting. The first two cycles of EPIC had been income volatility and consumer debt. These were ways that when households were earning money or having to spend money, it was about their financial issues. But all of the issues that came up in this cycle were about the rising costs. We chose housing because that was where the majority of people thought Aspen could add the most value at this point in time. But just so you know, the other two things that were coming up everywhere were dependent care and health care. So it's really, we tend to focus on the household balance sheet, but if we only focus there and we're not looking at where are the rising costs, where are the pain points that are externally driving families. So that was really where the field urged us to go. And it really also tracks with what we've been hearing in the focus groups we've been doing around the country with individuals on the ground, with community members. We heard through the work on debt and through the work on income volatility that people were struggling to pay rent, keep the lights on, provide a safe and stable housing for their kids, which I think is really one of the things that we heard over and over again. Issues with utility companies going into debt for basic bills, eviction stories, a lot of things that you in the room would be familiar with. So it made sense as a next step, and we are not daunted by very large processes that have to be kind of whittled down through a year of focus. I would say, again, housing is really unique for Aspen. We have incredible programs on all sorts of issues that address and contend with economic inequality. But really, this housing-specific work through a financial security frame is the first time Aspen Institute has done anything focused specifically on this issue. We know that many of our colleagues here that focus on anti-poverty work and public health and economic development and education and rural issues, they all see housing as a component of their work. And we thought that really this financial security frame could be something that helps us bring it all together and look at it with fresh eyes. Getting to the report that you all have in your seats, the Strong Foundations report really represents an incredibly intense year of research and synthesis and expert convenings and surveys and in-person retreats to get to the heart of the dimensions and drivers of the problems that are driving housing to be so unaffordable in America. And Catherine's going to go into this deeply right after this, and I'll introduce Catherine McKay. But at the 30,000-foot level, four things are really painstakingly clear. It's virtually impossible for a person or a family to be financially secure if they don't have affordable, stable housing. It represents the single most largest piece of their financial wallet on any given month, in any given year of their entire life. And so it really is going to have to be the bedrock of financial security to put housing at the center. Roughly 1 in 3 households living in housing live in housing that isn't affordable to them or that they can't depend on, that they can rely on to stay in. And these challenges have enormous negative impacts on lower income households, households of colors, and families with children. And I think fourth, and maybe more importantly, part of what EPIC can do is help us all see how this isn't just a problem for specific communities or specific households, it's a problem for all of us. That's really why we are focusing on affordable and stable housing within a framework of financial security. It's this piece that we know we can solve that becomes the means by which people can have true resilience in their financial lives, true ability to make choices further down the line, to make better decisions for their families' futures, to make better decisions about where they can work, to make better decisions about how they can really become embedded in and contribute to the vibrancy of a community. When families in the community are struggling with any of the things that unaffordable and unstable housing create for them, it's not just them. The ripple effects are huge. Public health suffers. Schools have barriers to achieving strong performance. Employers find it difficult to recruit and retain employees. Local economies are less vibrant because people are not having the discretionary income to spend in their communities. There's greater demand for government services such as utility assistance and nutrition support. And in aggregate, the financial impact is enormous, costing the economy more than $1 trillion in lost productivity, lost wages, lower consumer spending. It all adds up to slower growth. Let me just skip ahead here. I'm excited that we've talked about the fact that this, while it's the release of the primer, is the kicking off of really the parts of the EPIC process that we feel can drive us toward real change and impact. So we will be embarking on the next phase of our work, really cataloging, synthesizing, kicking the tires of the solutions that are out there, the solutions that need to be out there, the ways forward on those pieces. So I hope you join us and begin the start of following and contributing to this EPIC process over the next year. I'm going to turn this over, but just to give you a preview of the conversations, we've got leaders from different sectors and parts of the country here today. I really think that hearing from them is going to be better than, well, it's not going to be better than reading the report, or you want to read the report. But have the report alongside. Maybe get them to autograph it, with a piece that kind of relates to their most important part. I just think that there's, what I hope is that we've sized a really wicked problem in the primer. But we are actually coming out of it hugely optimistic because there is a lot that we can be doing. And we're going to be hearing from leaders who are really leading the cutting edge there. So first now, Catherine's going to come up. She's going to give a presentation on the key findings from the primer. Then we're going to have an interview, which I'm so excited about, between Stacey Vanek Smith, who is an economics journalist and co-host of NPR's daily economic podcast, The Indicator, which I listen to every day when I'm driving in, and Mayor Quinton Lucas of Kansas City, who is investing in affordable housing and expanding renters' rights, and I think not at all preoccupied with a Super Bowl coming up right now, so no problem there. We're going to hold questions for the mayor because he's going to come back and join the panel afterwards to field a bunch of questions. But right following that interview, we're going to have a great panel with leaders from healthcare and education and housing development, again, all from zip codes you cannot recite by heart. And then we're going to really get into that as a conversation among each other. So please use that hashtag. You can certainly come in with questions via Twitter. And really looking forward to the conversation, and I've talked way too long. So Catherine Lucas-McKay is a Financial Security Program Senior Program Manager. She's led the whole research process for this EPIC primer, and I invite her up to enlighten all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ida, and thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. As my colleagues have mentioned, this is the culmination of more than a year of research on our part, and it is the kickoff point for the most exciting part of the work, which is, now that we really understand the problem, how do we solve it? And how are folks out there already contributing to some excellent, groundbreaking solutions? So the report, you have this beautiful summary. There is also the full version, and if you are a person who wants to dig through the data tables and also maybe read a 10-year history of 225 years of housing policy and market development in the United States, this is your report. Please do read it. We put a lot of love into it, and I think that it is something, there's something there for you no matter who you are. I'm going to focus much more tightly, so that we're not here all day, on just some key things, the most important facts you need to know to really understand the problem. And then what are the causes? What has led us to this point where it's a serious challenge for 1 in 3 households just to be able to afford to pay their monthly housing costs? And then finally, what do we know about solutions? Folks have mentioned our hashtags up there on the screen. Please do use it. We do really love sharing both through Twitter and through LinkedIn. And with that, let me dive in to what is this key information that truly you need to know. First of all, 1 in 3 households are cost burdened. That means that they're paying more than 30% of their income for rent or mortgage, maintenance costs, utilities, insurance, all of the costs associated with housing. Now, when you get into renters, the picture is pretty dire. 1 in 4 renters is spending more than half of their income on housing. That is astounding, and it really doesn't leave room for much else in people's lives. We estimate that about 3 to 6 million people experience instability every year based on the figures that are available on being forced to move and having missed housing payments within the last year. So again, when you add it all up in aggregate, it's more than 40 million households. That's almost 100 million Americans who struggle with these challenges. And if there's 2 things that I want you all to take away, the first one is this: the trend looks bad. What you can see on the screen here is a graph that breaks down the housing cost burden rates, so people who are paying more than that 30% of their income, from 2001 to 2017. The most important lines are right at the top. The red indicates that for all of the past 20 years, low-income people, whether they are owners or renters, have been paying somewhere between 55 and 75% of, or 55 to 75% of those households have cost burdens. That's really astoundingly large. It means that most low-income households in America struggle with their biggest expense on a regular basis. The second line there, the dark blue underneath, really tells a story about how this problem has become a problem not just for low-income households, but farther and farther up the income ladder. That is households that are making between $20,000 and $50,000 a year. And over the past 2 decades, it has become so much more common to be cost burdened. Among renters, the rate is increased by 10 percentage points and by 20 percentage points for these moderate income homeowners. The problem is not distributed evenly. I think that it's probably not surprising that the groups listed here, renters, households of color, single parents, LGBTQ families, and disabled people, they all face other sources of marginalization, and they all struggle in accessing affordable and stable housing. The problem is also not evenly distributed on a geographic basis. What you see here on the screen is a map of the metro areas that added the most jobs in the past decade. Big red dots represent big job growth. Big blue dots represent big housing growth that matches the level of job growth. You notice that there are not very many of those. There's a lot of little blue dots, indicating that the places that have the strongest economic engines are not keeping up with the basics that they need to. Leading to rising costs in a lot of those well-known markets, like you mentioned, but even things like Salt Lake City, places that people may not be expecting. There's numerous places in Texas where housing has not kept up, even though that's kind of what we think of when we think of Texas and housing is build, build, build. So how did we get here? We found 4 dimensions of the problem, and they really are interlocking. All of them contribute to rising costs and instability in different ways. Every community experiences these problems in different ways to different degrees. Every housing market is different, but in some places, there are very large low-income populations where market rate housing isn't available. In others, that's less of the problem, and other things have a bigger role to play. When we talk about supply of housing and not having sufficient supply, there is the issue around high growth areas not adding enough homes for the jobs they add, but there's another thing there, and that is that plenty of areas have an amount of housing that's appropriate for the number of people, but that housing doesn't meet people's needs. It is either not located where jobs are located within that metro, it's not in good condition, it's not the price points people can afford, or it's simply not the type of housing. This especially is relevant for aging communities. A lot of times housing is not accessible, and that is really the biggest need. So that and preserving houses create different types of supply challenges all through the housing stock. And the drivers of that are really, these are the big 3. Land use policies and development regulations. So this is where can you build a single family home versus apartment buildings. It's things like minimum parking rules and even how many veto points the residents get for stopping a given development. Cost of land, land is a finite resource. Its cost for that reason tends to go up pretty reliably over time, especially in urban centers. But there's some really artificial restrictions on land across the country because there's unused land that cannot have houses added to it. And that's something that really drives up costs as well. And then the third factor, costs of construction. We've seen years of rising prices in the different factors that go into producing housing, whether it is the materials or the labor. We're starting to see it moderate, but especially for the past 6-7 years, it's been a real driver of rising costs. Insufficient household income and insufficient financial resources are another huge driver. Everywhere has a community of people who simply do not earn enough to make ends meet, and that means that they do not earn enough for market rate housing. That is a problem that is really severe. I think a lot of people will be familiar with the concept of the housing wage, and the fact that there's nowhere where the minimum wage is actually going to get you to that point of housing being affordable for a 2-bedroom apartment, which means there's a lot of families in a situation that's just very difficult to get through on a daily basis. So this isn't entirely a housing problem. If you have people who can't earn enough to make ends meet, it takes more than just housing to solve for that. But if people have housing, that's the foundation they need to start from. And there's not much that can be done to improve people's financial security conditions without that in place. Lack of savings is also a struggle. A lot of times having, the $1,000 in savings or $500 in savings is the difference between being able to afford your moving costs or being able to afford a repair that keeps your house habitable or not. Access to credit is another important factor. Now, there are supposed to be stopgaps because we recognize that poverty is a problem that exists everywhere and we need to help people with housing. But the amount of money that goes into it is just woefully insufficient. It is so far below what is needed that fewer than 1 in 4 households that are eligible for help actually get it. You have to be very low income to qualify for help, and we are leaving almost 8 million very low income families without any support right now. So in addition to that, there are a couple of market gaps that make a difference here. I'm not going to spend as much time on them, but lack of financing for smaller balance mortgages is a real challenge in many parts of the country where homes actually are affordable, but people cannot get the loan they need to purchase them. And then financing of home repair and maintenance costs is a serious problem for people whose income, credit scores, and home values don't allow them to draw on home equity credit for that purpose. Racial discrimination and segregation are the story of housing in America. It is impossible to understate how important that has been, not just for the experiences of people of color over time, but also for everyone, regardless of their race today. These patterns are deeply influenced by a racist history. That is also something that hasn't gone away just because we've passed the laws that we've needed to. There's good documentation that it is still ongoing. One thing that I think is really important is that when you look at the outcomes for Native Americans and Black Americans, you can see centuries of history. You can see the toll that it takes, and you can see the toll that it continues to take. And that's something that simply passing civil rights legislation has not stopped. It's deeply ingrained in society, and it's something that goes on now. I want to make the point that white families have never been explicitly disadvantaged because of their race when it comes to accessing housing. And that leads to a situation where when you look at the indicators, unsurprisingly, white households do better on pretty much every front you can imagine. And one of the things that we learned is that it's actually sometimes hard to quantify the extent of that because there's just not enough research that takes a broad view. A lot of it is much more focused on just differences between Black and white populations. The final issue that I want to talk about is the policy environment for renters. Renters also tend to have higher levels of unaffordability, higher levels of instability, and really struggle. It doesn't have to be that way. Someone said that to me in our research process, and I was kind of like, it doesn't have to be that way. And it really got us thinking differently about all of the factors that make life more difficult than it has to be for renters. Those include things like regulations that you can't predict even from town to town, the way that our contract law and property rights systems work, and the fact that renters don't have the financial resources when they need to be in court or fighting a landlord to do so effectively. And again, lack of enforcement is a problem in this space as much as it is in terms of racial discrimination. So these 4 factors really are the ones that we found that are driving quite a bit of the increase in both rising costs and in rising levels of instability. They are the things that when we talk about what are we solving for, it's getting at those issues. How do you disrupt those problems so that housing costs themselves are able to come down, so that people are able to have more ability to stay where they are when their housing situations are working well for them. I am going to turn this over right now to folks that I think that we are very excited to hear from, probably more than me, because the solutions that are out there are really cool. There's a lot that we can do that could solve these issues today. And there's areas where Mayor Quinton Lucas, the mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, he is a fascinating figure in that he ran on an affordable housing platform that is not what you normally see in these types of mayoral races, and has then continued to follow through on the commitment to renters in ways that I hope you will find as impressive and inspiring as we have. And he will be joined by Stacey Vanek Smith, as mentioned. The Indicator from Planet Money. You should be listening to that. That's your 7 to 10 minute snack of daily economic news every day. I've plugged it, so now you don't have to. Many of us know she is a fantastic interviewer, and I think we're about to have a wonderful conversation. Thank you all so much. And as you hear about these solutions, please do. We want to hear everything from you.
Mayor Lucas, welcome. And you are going into this is your 6th month
My 6th month, yes.
in office. How's it going so far?
6 months in, I've been able to promise that I'm the first mayor in 50 years to bring a Super Bowl to Kansas City. And it's amazing because I don't get a lot of questions.
Is that a direct correlation?
Right. I think, you vote for the right guy, that happens immediately.
I mean, you can't prove it didn't happen.
That's right.
So, and you, before being elected mayor, though, you served on the city council for years, and you headed the housing committee. You also grew up in Kansas City, Missouri.
Yes.
So before we get started talking about what you've implemented since being elected, what is the housing situation in Kansas City?
It is troubled. And I think, and I appreciated this presentation so much, because when you read national publications, see events like this, you read about certain cities all the time. The challenge is that this is an aggressive and pronounced challenge in Middle America, in small towns, really in some ways everywhere. And I'll do just a little background on my life. I grew up knowing homelessness. I grew up in one of those families that was very housing insecure. And so actually in adulthood was the first time I had lived anywhere for longer than 2 years in a row. We moved around a lot, and the thing that was kind of most interesting to me, I went on to school, I got out of town, and when I came back, so much was the same. We saw that our traditionally segregated living patterns that exist in Kansas City remain that very way. We saw that particularly our single-family parent households continue to have significant concerns with being able to find housing stability. And frankly, and I appreciated this in the presentation, our remedies were wholly ineffective. I went to law school, and I remember one of the most interesting things when I was taking my first year property class is that so many of the rules are 500 years old, right? And indeed, some of the rules are still the same name. And so they say, right, if you have some problem with your renter's rights, then you have your implied warranty of habitability. How fascinating, right? That someone could actually try to file a legal action, right? But no lawyer will take up the case because there isn't money to be made out of it. And no regular tenant will actually have the time, the ability, and really try to address such a thing. And so I'm just answering the status of our housing market, I guess. We have issues, to say the least.
What brought you back to Missouri to be in local politics after having left?
A few different things. I attended law school at Cornell, and I was going to go down to New York City to practice like everybody told me I should. But I liked having a little bit more space.
It's
not
understandable.
right. I don't necessarily live on I'm with a New Yorker, no less,
Yeah.
so she knows. But I think actually more seriously, I always saw the opportunity to try to address social problems in my part of the country. We have in the Midwest and the South, there is always such an exodus of talent. And there are people far more talented than me. But I thought, well, you know what? I know the problems of where I'm from. And rather than just kind of hearing about them from my mother or my sisters, I could have the chance to go back and try to make some level of difference. And for me, what that meant, and we've talked about race a little bit, I didn't know I was going to run for mayor or council or anything. I just thought being a black dude in a suit who wasn't a preacher was going to be something that a lot of kids had never seen. I never saw a brother in a suit when I was growing up to and including like in funerals, right? And so just being around was to me something different, and that's the reason that I went back.
So you got onto city council and started addressing housing issues almost right away, including affordability. Was one of the first.
Right. I think so my predecessor is mayor, and this is kind of an interesting time in American cities. First of all, not all, no, all of the good policy work is really being done in state legislatures. And I'm sorry, in city councils, not legislatures. State legislatures aren't doing anything. I have a little joke, and because we're just among friends, no offense to any state legislators here, they'll be like, I really didn't like that guy. But I think you are seeing, particularly and I don't want to be partisan, but particularly in red state America, where our legislatures are spending lots of time making even stranger gun laws. I mean, I think soon in Missouri they'll propose that everyone has to just have a gun. They do a lot of that. We're still fighting culture wars in a lot of our state legislatures. Frankly, good housing policy, I think, is lacking in some ways. And so at the city council level, I was named chair of the housing committee, and I think the mayor thought that I would only kind of be the committee that just hands out grants, right? HUD gives us about $8 million a year, and we would just disperse that. I thought, frankly, that there was far more that we could do. There were key questions of how is our land use policy. And by the way, if you look at land use in the United States, post-World War II, we largely codified lots of ways that created this suburban style living pattern. Single family zoning, large streets and roads. So even in American cities, even in the cities, right, you have lots of land use policy that is fundamentally, I think, anti the creation of affordable housing. It creates segregated neighborhoods and has perpetuated that for 70 years. And so I thought, well, what the heck? You know, I can't get something passed in the state legislature. Lord knows I can't do anything in Washington, but I can get a lot done here. And if we can create a model for good affordable housing policy, good land use policy, then that can get us somewhere. And fortunately, I think we had a community that finally said, wow, this is exciting because we've been crying out for this for years as well.
And you ran on a lot of housing issues.
Yes.
And when you were elected, I think you spent time in a low income in a low income apartment.
I did. First of all, running for office is a fascinating experience. If you've never done it, do it once. I don't know if you'll do it again. I've done it twice. I maybe got one time left. But you know, here was the thing about my campaign. They always tell you to run a poll at some point, and I didn't want to because I don't necessarily trust them. But we ran a poll, and poll one ranked the most important issues to the voters of Kansas City. And it would be interesting. You may wonder what was it, but about 50% of the electorate said we care a lot about potholes. The next highest issue was education at about 10%. Housing was at about roughly 4%. And I said, oh my gosh, right? And one reason potholes actually poll so well is because they're the one equitable thing in all of America, right? Whether you live in a good neighborhood or a bad one, usually you just run into them. But what I took from that was not just talk about potholes. It was that, frankly, nobody ever talks about housing, right? Nobody really ever runs a campaign on saying, wait a second, our substandard housing stock is undermining the future of our city. And usually we just say, well, you know, there's a problem in that neighborhood and it isn't really affecting us. But what I was able to do in our housing platform as a campaigner was to link it to every other issue. Because then all of a sudden, right, if you said, well, no, housing fundamentally relates to the quality of our schools. Housing then relates to crime in our city, which is out of control. Housing actually relates, after a while, to our infrastructure and those dreaded potholes. And so you can't actually solve for this end run result, which is how we fund our infrastructure, how we lack a tax base to do it, et cetera, without actually looking at the core issue, which to me was housing. So I ran on that, but then I also was aided by an advocacy group in Kansas City. I wasn't actually aided by them. There was a group by the name of KC Tenants, and they were this aggressive, interesting, enthralling, and engaging tenants' rights group. And I love their formation because another thing from that poll that I saw was this, right? The electorate really isn't reflective of any jurisdiction. I know that because I got a poll result back and they said, hey, candidate Lucas, you run great with minorities and young whites. And I said, well, that seems like a good chunk of the people. And they said, no, not the electorate. And I said, well, what are young whites? And they said, it's white persons under 50. Most of your electorate is white folks over 50, and you really need to kind of work on your issues more. We did well with them ultimately. But what I liked about KC Tenants was it broke the mold of what local government elections usually are. Usually it is established community groups that actually get most of the questions, the debates. It's folks who've been voting for years and years. This was a group of largely folks that had not been voters before, folks who have been released from incarceration, some folks who'd had any number of experiences, and were pretty out front in saying, yeah, we need housing too. And so they were a key part of what I think was putting that agenda on the forefront, and I think the voters responded to it well.
It seems like it might be kind of a risky move, though, because they're such a politicized group. It's not a group that typically votes a lot, as you're saying. And it seems like if you're running for office, you always want to appeal to the middle of the road. At least that's the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, you would think that, particularly because I'm in middle America too. And so, yeah, the encouragement would be to be that way. But I think this, nobody actually, particularly because, and I don't have children myself, but just telling my own life story and recognizing life stories of so many others, so many young people. It's really hard to say that a 4-year-old should have to live in an apartment unit that has lead exposure. It's very hard to say that a bunch of children should have to move around all the time, going from school to school, undermining their education. I think the body politic recognized how important and fundamental it was that we actually address this issue long term. And I love it, including my older white voters in the polls, because they also said, you know what, that is a problem for us, and it's a problem that we want to address. And I'll say an advantage of a city of the size of Kansas City or Cincinnati or Indianapolis is that you're big enough to have big problems, but you're still small enough to actually say, well, you know what, we can really address it, and we can really change it.
And you had two sort of main tenets of your housing policy, I guess, when you ran. One was a tenants' Bill of Rights.
Yes, ma'am.
And one was a housing fund. Do you mind describing both of those?
So the Tenants' Bill of Rights is very simply this. I talked about the fact that there are all of these old legal standards that for 500 years have allegedly protected tenants in the landlord-tenant relationship. What we have seen over the last probably century or so is that, frankly, those have not really been exercised often to the protection of tenants. So in our Tenants' Bill of Rights, we were in essence codifying a set of protections that often already exist in law, but that you really didn't have a remedy for. What good is a court if no one can actually use the court? Right? And so that's really, frankly, folks, the problem with our whole civil justice system. I'll talk to you about criminal law someday too, because I got issues there and want to pardon every marijuana conviction in Kansas City, and we'll be doing that soon because the mayor can do that. But I love this pardon power; it's amazing. And unlike the folks in Washington, I'm using it for like good people. Nevertheless, I think the other thing that I wanted to do was to say, how can we, through municipal governance and policy, create some remedy for people that are dealing with substandard housing providers? And frankly, what we've been able to do is establish an office that can help investigate. We've been able to let people know of their rights. Often people don't even know that they have rights against any type of situation. And so that was an important part of that. Housing Trust Fund is another. And so on the Housing Trust Fund side, the idea was you have to find resources to help support and stimulate the creation of housing. I think of housing in 3 key areas: creation, quality, and preservation. On the creation side, that's what the Housing Trust Fund is all about. It's not enough just to wait for the private market necessarily to develop, although we'll hear from some folks who I think have been very innovative in how we do that. But we need to make sure that we're part of that too. On the quality side, that is making sure tenants know of their rights. And on the preservation side, I really mean preservation is the opposite of demolition. My predecessor never really found money for housing creation, but they found $10 million to demolish a bunch of homes in Kansas City so we could follow the Detroit model. I hate that. Demolition is not a housing policy. And too many American cities have acted like that is the case. When you have substandard single-family housing stock, instead of saying, wow, let's try to preserve these neighborhoods and recreate them, all we've done is abandon them. And we have created long-term blight that in some situations is very hard to dig out from. So that's what we're working on in the Housing Trust Fund, our Bill of Rights proposals, and they've actually been received fairly well.
And the Tenants Bill of Rights passed last month, is that right?
It passed last month. Although I think you'll ask me about it, it was one of the most fractured political debates that we've had, because you had tenants' rights advocates, and including I had some folks on the city council who said, "Oh, these are just a bunch of kids and others that are trying to basically destroy housing policy in the way we know it." And a group of housing providers really organized against us and said,
Like developers and landlords? And
Yes, landlords. They told me that they don't like to be called landlords anymore, and they wanted housing providers. And so I said,
Housing
okay,
providers.
I'm still going to pass an ordinance you don't like, but yes, HPs. All right. So a lot of our housing providers, the oddest thing was, and I was in a televised debate about it, they didn't actually have problems with the Tenants' Bill of Rights. They had these kind of almost dreamed up problems. I was like, oh my gosh, somebody brought Ronald Reagan back to life. And I felt like I was in like a 1980 presidential debate, because they said, oh, but the regulation and the freedom and all of that. And they used the articles in front of the words too, just like I did. And it was odd, because I said, no, but what's your actual substantive problem with what we're trying to do? Do you have a problem with us saying that if there are health code violations, right, then a landlord should have to fix them within a month, and they can actually get a loan from the city? And they said, no problem. Do you have a problem with any of these other issues? No. But we just have a problem with actually answering to some regulatory framework. There will be more litigation. There'll be all of that. And so what we had to do was try to dispel that. And I think we were pretty successful, but it goes to show that when you're really trying to make changes in housing policy, there's some strong pushback.
what's in the Tenants' Bill of Rights?
So in the Tenants' Bill of Rights are a number of different things, and it only runs probably 3 or 4 pages. And so at first, it actually speaks to, and the reason it is a Bill of Rights, it is the tenants have rights to any number of things, right? Utilities that will function. For example, I'll give you a question, or an issue that was a big fight for us, air conditioning. We put in the Tenants' Bill of Rights that if the housing provider sells the unit or rents to you a unit that has functioning air conditioning, you have to make sure that the air conditioning works. Like Washington, the summers get fairly hot where we are. Housing providers pushed back and said, well, we often have, I grew up often without air conditioning. And they said, well, are you guaranteeing air conditioning? We said, no, we're not. If you rent units that don't have it, then you can continue to do that. You just have to make sure your stuff works. Because so often, right, promises aren't kept, and you have folks that are relying on them but don't have the ability to move. So what we said is, right, utilities have to function, right? Landlords have to give better notice in some ways before inspections. Landlords have to make sure that they're actually providing some resource for tenants and some actually right to what is in essence an arbitration type procedure where there are some significant disputes. Those are the things that we had come up with. Frankly, I think it's fair on both sides because the landlord also has the opportunity to talk to their tenant and work with them. And I think that's the reason that it passed.
I know that there was quite a bit of pushback from landlords, from housing providers. And a lot of kind of threats of taking business elsewhere.
Yes.
And I know that Kansas City, Missouri is right on the border with Kansas City, Kansas.
Yes.
And there's long been a lot of incentives, millions of dollars in incentives to lure businesses from one side of the border to the other. Are you worried? And there's also a big construction worker shortage in Missouri. Are you worried at all that passing the Tenants' Bill of Rights might kind of push a lot of the housing development into Kansas? and out of your
Yeah,
community?
and short answer is no. And you may wonder why, because yes, lots of our housing providers said, I'm never doing business with you, and we're all going to the suburbs and that sort of thing. Here's the thing. There is a giant market of people, right? And what we have to realize, for those of us who actually care about people, is that the consumers should have power as well. Right? I studied antitrust law in law school, and so much of which it barely exists anymore in this country. But so much of it is about the fact that we wanted to actually make sure that markets work and that consumers have some level of power, not just providers. And so my view is no, a collective of consumers can matter, right? There are lots of people that need housing. There are lots of people that will pay for housing of some sort. And so my thought is, yes, we'll have more responsible housing providers. Mr. Barron's a housing provider in our community. And frankly, I appreciate having those opportunities to have more of those types of folks. We've received the threats, but the interesting thing that happens when you do this is that even our suburban community started to say, well, that's a great idea. And we're seeing more pay attention to a lot of the proposals that we've had. And you see it spread actually throughout a state like Missouri, which is not housing policy woke in the slightest. And so I think, frankly, we can, and cities always should be, I think, a positive example of what can be achieved, particularly because we have the volume of people, we have the ability to actually make that change.
So you are 6 months into your term. What do you see as the future going forward? Like, what is your hope? What would you ideally achieve?
We have to remind people that this is a priority in the same way that recreation, downtown baseball stadiums are a priority. I'll tell you about a public policy conversation in Kansas City. Our baseball team, the Royals, just got bought by a new owner. Great, cool, he's a billionaire, that's lovely. Almost immediately, the top question I started getting was not about housing or crime. It is, are we going to get a new downtown baseball stadium? And that's fine. That's really interesting, perhaps. But I thought, well, how do I get people to care about this? To me, actually, the biggest challenge is making sure that people care, right? And it's the darndest thing because all of us sleep somewhere, right? Somewhere. And no matter the richest person, the poorest person in our country, they all sleep somewhere. And maybe the way we have to focus it is, where do you sleep policy, right? How do you change it from, I think, the traditional viewpoint? And then there's also this. Because everyone sleeps somewhere, everybody thinks they're actually informed on housing policy. And they think, well, every American seems to think, even ones that haven't done economically well in life, think that, well, I worked hard, and so therefore I shouldn't worry about anybody else who needs affordable housing. I have people all the time in part of my city who tell me, you shouldn't call it affordable housing. You should call them starter homes. And I said, why? Why am I hiding the 8 ball? I mean, I think it is actually important to say that housing is a right and that outcomes are better. There is, and this is just me talking, I'm a politician. It actually, it ticks me off that when I've had my political career, there have been lots of people. I visited our state legislature the other day, and lots of Republicans in the state legislature said, hi, Mayor, I'm so proud of your life story. You are a great exception to the rule of inner cities, and you made it out, and I just wish we could mentor all the other kids and they'd be just like you. I'm like, no, that's terrible. That is terrible. I don't want anybody else to grow up like I did. Right? I don't want anybody else to actually go through that struggle. I don't want somebody to know, right, all of these different things, to have to, and I can go through all the different, I don't want anybody to have, my life wasn't that tough. My mother's life was tough. Can you imagine how hard it is to have 3 children, right? You don't know where you'll be, and you're making those true choices, as we've discussed before, between, and I know it sounds dramatic, but it's true, between food, or at least the type of food you're gonna get. Right? Are you going to buy the really terrible, cheapest food possible for your children? Or are you going to actually try to take care of them, get healthy stuff? Are you going to pay your rent? Are you going to have bus fare? And that's the sort of thing that I think we need to make sure people remember. And even in places that are moderate to even slightly conservative, I think people get it if you can frame the issue in the right way of, do you want to make sure you're taking care of folks? The housing providers, the landlords tried to push us into a left-right, is this good or bad type of thing. And I think what I just said, and that's why I always go back to that example, does some child have to be exposed to terrible living conditions? That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about a lazy mother who has too many children. Don't even get started on that because they love to go with that. What we're talking about is the future of our community.
finally, Mayor, like, what do you see as like the solution? Is it more housing? Is it lower rent? Is it vouchers? Like, what is the best way to address the problem, or to start to address
Yeah,
it?
I mean, so I will go slightly out of the housing policy realm because one thing that was noted at the end of the presentation, there is an income challenge in our country. Wages have been depressed for years, and frankly, in every community, we need to address it, from our largest ones to our smaller ones, because that is, to me, a significant challenge. I think what I discussed before, housing preservation does present an opportunity for us. I think there is a question on, do we have enough affordable quality units? The answer is no. So how can we better incentivize, in the same way that we have incentivized in every major American city, big downtown office development, right? How do we actually incentivize long-term housing development, not just in the multifamily space, but also, frankly, in communities like mine, single-family development, et cetera, rehab, and that sort of thing. And frankly, that presents, I think, outstanding opportunities for smaller-scale rehabbers, right? Minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses to actually get into the housing business more substantially and significantly than we typically see.
Excellent. Well, Mayor Lucas, thank you so much for
Thank you.
talking with us. And now I'm going to hand it over to Genevieve Melford. She's the director of EPIC, and she's going to lead a panel discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. I think we're going to take a quick minute for some rearranging of chairs, and then I'm going to invite my three illustrious panelists up to join us. Thank you, team. Okay, great, thanks. Come on up. And the order, do you guys remember your order? I think I do, but you might have been paying even more attention. Perfect, you got it. Thank you so much. So as was mentioned earlier, we're going to have, following this panel, we're going to invite Mayor Lucas back up and have a Q&A with everyone. So please do be thinking about your questions for these folks as we chat. And in about 35, 40 minutes, we will be transitioning to a Q&A with all these folks and Mayor Lucas. So I am so delighted to introduce these panelists, all of whom really inspire me. And I had prep calls with them, not with Mayor Lucas, and now I'm deeply inspired by him too. Here from my right, working to my farther right, we have Jeff Gatlin, the Chief Operating Officer of the Roaring Fork School District. Yes, you heard that right, School District. Then Angela Mingo, Community Relations Director from Nationwide Children's Hospital, a hospital, not a houser. And then, of course, Richard Barron, co-founder and chairman of McCormick Barron Salazar, which is really a well-known and very leading housing developer, but you'll be hearing from him a lot about how his model includes more than just providing home, and his philosophy that housing, kind of in the same way that Mayor Lucas talked about and the way that Catherine did too, is the foundation for family thriving. And so that's been really foundational to his model. So he's sort of non-traditional in that way. So let's get started. I want to first ask Jeff and Angela to talk about how housing first became an issue that really was on your radar. This is not your core business. Why is it something that you've chosen to focus on?
So the Roaring Fork School District is on the western slope of Colorado, and it has the communities of Glenwood Springs, Carbondale, and Basalt. The next community up the river is Aspen. And so it really is a piece of paradise on the western slope of Colorado. So with that, we see an extremely high cost of living, and we have the same challenges a lot of communities have around extremely high home prices, like I said, just general high cost of living. And as a school district, I think we've struggled with how do we solve that? The way that school districts in Colorado are funded, it's an extremely complicated formula, but we're very limited in how much we can put towards teacher salaries. So we're a little bit handcuffed in that regard. And so I think this has been an issue. I've been with the school district about 7 years. This was certainly an issue prior to me getting there. I think there were a combination of a few things that allowed us to gain momentum to try to make progress towards this issue. We have a very progressive leadership in the district now that I think was willing to take this on. We have a very progressive school board who is willing to take this on. We also did 2 major community outreach projects that also really started to build momentum and start to garner the community support that we really felt like we needed to launch some housing solutions. The first one was going through a major strategic planning and visioning process where we had just over 1,000 community members, teachers, students, administrators really work with us to determine what's the direction the school district should be taking. So one of the outcomes of that was we really need to focus on recruiting and retaining the highest quality staff that we can. No surprise there. But one of the powerful parts of the process is that it came from within the community. The next piece that followed that, the strategic planning process was in 2014. In 2015, we went through a facilities master planning process where we did a lot of community outreach again. And we had a couple hundred, 200 to 300 folks in the community come out to give us input around what's important that they want to see in school facilities. So after engaging that process, we went out to our local voters for a bond for facilities improvements, but included in that bond was $15 million to start a rental housing program for our staff. And that was really the key for kicking this off.
And it was really this sense that you were not able to recruit and retain the staff that you wanted without finding a way to solve for the mismatch of salaries and housing costs where you are.
That's right.
Yeah, which I think is so interesting to think about just in terms of any kind of employer.
And you know, that's our core mission. You know, the first thing that families ask when they come to communities, how are the schools? So the most critical thing we can do is put the highest quality staff member in every classroom that we can. Certainly core to our mission. Yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. What about you, Angela?
Yeah, so Nationwide Children's Hospital, you know, it was really interesting for us when we started this work. We were embarking upon the expansion of our main campus. So embarking upon an $870 million expansion that included a new inpatient tower for our main campus and the addition of green space and other facilities. And as we started to look at this hospital expansion of ours, we began to ask ourselves, how do we not only expand and improve our campus, but how do we start to look at quality of health in our immediate neighborhood? And there were a couple things that were happening during that time. Our mayor was looking at how does he continue to strengthen our city neighborhoods throughout the city of Columbus. This was post-recession. There was a high volume of vacant, blighted residential properties. So Nationwide Children's, we see patients from all 50 states, internationally, and from all of our corners of the county. And as folks are driving into our facilities, we recognize that they're driving through the blight. They're seeing what we're seeing. And our children who are being serviced in that immediate neighborhood are living amongst blight. We're seeing kids each and every day walk to school and pass vacant, blighted residential properties. And so we said, if we're going to truly impact health, we're going to need to go outside of the walls of the hospital. And so that's when we elected and decided with our board support to start a neighborhood place-based initiative called Healthy Neighborhoods, Healthy Families. And affordable housing serves as the hub of our initiative. And we've wrapped that around with, typically in the affordable housing space, we would say supportive services. In healthcare, we define that as social determinants of health. So how can we move the needle on social determinants of health by impacting housing, making sure it's affordable housing for those families who cannot afford market rate housing? And in our case, because we are a pediatric hospital, there's a high volume of Medicaid patients that we serve. So when you look at families who qualify for affordable housing, those are our Medicaid patients that we're at risk for. So what better way to keep them healthy than to provide affordable housing? We also looked at other areas of support. And so those areas, again, other social determinants of health include how can we impact the workforce development and training opportunities for residents in our neighborhood. You know, it was really interesting when I came to the hospital, we were starting this community conversation about our campus expansion, and we had a big community public meeting. In my previous life, I had worked at city council, so I really appreciate all the comments of Mayor Lucas. And you know, when you've sat through lots of public meetings, you really can let people fire it off and take these hits. And so it was really kind of exciting to still be in that space, but be in the realm of healthcare. And I anticipated all these questions about our medical facilities. But the questions that came to us were, how are you going to ensure jobs for the residents who live here with your expansion? How are you going to impact safety? And so we said, these are some of the areas that we need to look at. In addition to affordable housing, we are going to make a commitment to work with our local community development corporation to impact safety, to impact workforce development, to provide pathways for residents who live in our immediate corridors so that they could become those entry-level workers for those who were entry-level and then continue to move up within the hospital. We're talking about school districts, and so the city of Columbus has one of the largest school districts in the state of Ohio with 65,000 students, but most of our schools are failing in the neighborhood immediate to our campus. How can we be a world-class health center and not impact our schools? And so education became another component of our neighborhood initiative. And so over the years, we've been focused on vacant, blighted properties. We heard a little bit about housing preservation. That was a huge component for us. The residents, when we started to talk about not only expansion of our campus, but going into the neighborhood through our program, which is known as Healthy Neighborhoods, Healthy Families, it was really interesting. What you learn in public service is that you keep your skeptics very close and you bring them under the tent very early. And so we called all of our skeptics and said, our mayor's coming down, our CEO's coming down, we're gonna make this major announcement and we want you right there with us. And I can still remember some of the looks on the faces in that space when we were right at ground level, standing in front of a vacant, blighted property on one of the worst streets across the street from our hospital. And folks were looking and they were watching then. And now 10 years later, we've been able to improve over 300 residential properties within our footprint, focused on 3 areas of affordable housing. One, again, housing preservation, going in and working with our city and county land bank to improve vacant, blighted properties. Also working in home repair. So one of the things I was really concerned about when we started this work, my background is urban planning. I'm an urban planner by profession working in a healthcare institution, which I think we need more urban planners in healthcare. I'm definitely a firm advocate, but my concern was gentrification and the concern or the perception of gentrification. Because at that point in time, we were fortunate that our mayor had pulled in neighborhood stabilization funds to enable our housing work. Now, the beauty of those funds is that we were able to create a very robust, rich housing model. What was interesting is that you really couldn't tell the affordable housing, which was scattered site single-family housing, from the market rate housing. So the whole concept of gentrification mattered, and we're still educating residents about what it means to build affordable housing. We are below market rate. We build this housing at a cost, and we have a very robust collaboration of partners who enable this work. But to make sure that those existing residents were being the beneficiaries of the investment that was happening by Nationwide Children's, we started a home repair grant program. And so residents were able to each and every year qualify or apply for repairs for the exterior of their homes. And what we first saw is that no one applied. And I think there were, unfortunately, some lessons learned by families who had been subject to situations where they thought they were getting an improvement or an investment, and there were lots of different scams. I think we've all seen them across our cities, and especially our senior population, they were just very skeptic. So we were going door to door, meeting with civic groups, sharing this benefit. Now we can't produce enough grants to offset the demand and the interest in our neighborhood. And so the home repair grant program has been very vital. And then what we're continuing to see in part of the conversation and presentation earlier today is that there's this huge bandwidth of need for renters. We had started in the space of home ownership to really help stabilize a market that was in a complete state of disrepair, where we didn't even have comps to sell our first home. But then we learned that 54,000 households in our city are paying more than 50% of their income towards rent. It's a national conversation that we're all seeing. And we had to make a shift. And we realized that if we were truly going to impact our population health, our patient families, we had to provide affordable rental. And so now that's where we're focusing our efforts.
Wow. Thank you. I'm going to get into some more details about the model and your partnerships when we come back around. But Richard, can you talk to us just about your story? What was the impetus for starting your company, and kind of what was the problem that you were solving for, and why this model?
Sure. Well, I'm probably the oldest one in the room, and I was very interested in listening to the mayor. I came out of law school in the late 60s, and I had grown up in Detroit in a real blue-collar, middle-income neighborhood, and went to a elementary school that was a mixed school with all kinds of kids from different backgrounds. And I was headed off into a career in international law and finance. I'd worked at OMB in Washington. And the riots broke out in Detroit. Dr. King was killed. Bobby Kennedy was killed. And I just decided I had to do some sort of public service. I wasn't sure what that was. But I joined a fellowship program that had just been started by the Poverty Program in Washington, and I was assigned to the St. Louis Legal Aid Society. And I joined a staff of 8 other lawyers and became enmeshed with all kinds of housing issues in St. Louis. The city had been close to 1 million people after the Second World War. When I got there, the population was down to about 600,000. Today it's 320,000. The out-migration of whites and middle-income black families was staggering. The school district had 80,000 kids in it when I got there. It's down to 20,000 today. So it was a very, very distressed city, had the highest incidence of lead paint poisoning of young children per capita in the United States. And when I arrived at Legal Aid, the director, who was an old-line guy that couldn't have gotten a job in private law practice, said, "Richard, we got to set up a housing unit. You're the head of it." And I was 26 years old. I didn't know up from down. And suddenly I'm confronted with hundreds of cases of young children and families who are living in distress. All of the indices that have been described were probably twice in St. Louis. But more importantly, I became embroiled in a rent strike against the St. Louis Housing Authority. St. Louis was the home of the infamous Pruitt-Igoe development. And we had 6,000 units in those days. And the Housing Authority was totally incompetent. I was representing residents. Their rents kept getting raised by the Housing Authority because in those days there was no federal operating subsidy for local housing authorities. And that changed in the rent strike in St. Louis when I wrote the Brooke Amendment to provide federal operating subsidies for public housing as one way of trying to get out of this situation. But I suppose the most telling situation for me was about 3 weeks after I arrived in St. Louis, the director said, "Well, they're having a meeting at the Pruitt-Igoe Community Center." And Pruitt-Igoe, for those of you who don't know it, was 3,500 units of 13-story high-rise buildings. And when I went to the community center, about 1/3 of the development was occupied. The rest of it was totally abandoned. And I looked out the windows, and there was absolute devastation everywhere. Broken windows, glass all over the grounds, gnarled playground equipment, packs of dogs running across. And in the community meeting, there were about 30 social services agencies in St. Louis who were theoretically supposed to be working with the families of Pruitt-Igoe. And there were no families from Pruitt-Igoe in the meeting. And I'm looking at this, and this is just absolutely crazy. What the hell is going on here? And I listened for a couple of hours, and this agency was working on this problem, and this one was in this problem. There are no residents there, a couple of housing managers. And that started my odyssey with housing. And I spent the next 3-4 years at Legal Services, handled hundreds of cases. I also litigated a lot of exclusionary zoning cases, fair housing cases, and was looking at this issue that we're talking about today, which very frankly hasn't changed at all to speak of, with one exception. And I was thinking about it as I flew in here this morning. The last budget of President Carter for HUD before Reagan took over was $135 billion. Last year, Congress appropriated about $30 billion for HUD. To give you an idea of what has happened in the United States. And most of that money for HUD was all about subsidized rental housing that was built back in the old days, the 236 mortgage interest reduction programs. And what happened under the Reagan administration is they moved all the money from HUD into the Defense Department. And so that was really what happened. There was a demise of any kind of focus at HUD on affordable housing to speak of. And there were several other programs that were operating in those days. The Urban Development Action Grant Program, which is terrific in terms of working in underserved neighborhoods. It was flexible money that you could use. We used it in Quality Hill in Kansas City. It was the largest UDAG grant that HUD had made. And it gave you the ability to do both retail and housing and affordable housing. I became very, very concerned about the concentration of poverty in public housing sites. And as I started to move to different cities, we did a lot of work in those days with the Ford Foundation. We were working with CDCs, which had just started to emerge around the country. Neighborhood Housing Services Program was started. LISC was started by the Ford Foundation. Enterprise Foundation with Jim Rouse. And so all of these programs were ultimately designed to try to deal with this housing issue. And in '73, I got tired of practicing law because I was really just practicing. And I decided I had to see if we could do something more in a lot of these underserved neighborhoods that I was seeing. And the thing that did it for me is that I had a lead paint case, one that I had filed at Legal Services, and I went before a judge on a motion to dismiss by the landlord's attorney. I argued the motion on a Friday morning, and I was the last guy on the docket, and it was at 11 o'clock, and I was getting very angry because this guy had maintained a slum property in the north side of St. Louis. And the judge looked at me and he said, "Counselor, you have anything more to say? I read your motion." I said, "Well, Your Honor, you know, this is a hell of a serious problem in St. Louis." He said, "Well, Counselor, I have a tee-off time at 11:30, and I wish that you could speed up your argument." That's when I decided to get out of law practice. So what happened is that I began to look at working with a lot of the nonprofit organizations that I had represented as an attorney in St. Louis who were on the north side of the city, which was largely African American, to see if I could figure out a way to go into these neighborhoods and start to rebuild them. And whether it was preservation of existing housing or it was vacant land, there was urban renewal land that had been sitting for decades because the redevelopment authority had torn down a lot of houses. We started there, and we started doing developments in St. Louis, both historic rehab and new infill construction. And then my partner and friend at that point was Tony Salazar from Kansas City. Tony called me up. He says, "Barron, will you come over to Kansas City?" I said, "Sure. What do you got?" He said, "Oh, I got all kinds of groups that need help, and nobody around here is willing to work in their neighborhoods." And I can tell you that someone said to me as I left St. Louis to go to Kansas City, "Richard, don't forget that St. Louis is where the South ended and Kansas City is where the West begins. You're going to find a whole different kind of community over there," as indeed it was and still is. But that's how I got into the business. And over the last 4 decades, we'll have done more than 25,000 rental units across the United States, about 35 cities. We've done a lot of work with new markets tax credits in these neighborhoods. But the most important part of what happens with McCormick Barron is Urban Strategies, which is a C3 that I set up in the late 70s. Because as I began working in public housing communities and low-income neighborhoods, it was very clear to me that to combine the integration of service for families and kids with the physical redevelopment of the neighborhoods was just an absolute critical part of it. So that as we have moved into these larger scale mixed income neighborhoods and rebuilt them, Urban has worked with families and kids in these same neighborhoods, dealing with healthcare, early child care, schools, after school programs, job training, and we combine both things. And so the strategies team works along with the development company as we go into new communities and work with the neighborhoods and plan these developments. And so that's really been the model that I've taken on. And very frankly, it grew out of my experiences with the public housing sites. Once we got into a situation in St. Louis in the early 70s where we were able to create tenant management organizations to work in these public housing sites in St. Louis after the rent strike. We were able to get funding through the Ford Foundation and others to set up these organizations where residents got trained and took on the site management of the public housing sites. And what was clear is that we needed all these interventions. Getting the heads of household into employment was one of the challenges, but we had all kinds of issues related to the children and the schools and the teachers being scared of going into the public housing sites. And so the integration of strategies in McCormick Barron has really been the model that we have used all these years and continue to use. Yeah. And it's probably been the most successful way of intervening in these distressed neighborhoods and working with the families and children.
So you raised a couple issues that I want to pick up on and ask you folks. When we had our prep call, Angela, you said we always get asked about the dollars and cents. How does this work financially? And so I was wondering if each of you could talk a little bit about, I mean, how does it work? Where does the money come from to do this when this isn't your main business?
So I would say for Nationwide Children's, this has been a bit of an evolution in terms of the financial structure. When we started Healthy Neighborhoods, Healthy Families, and started to dive deeper into affordable housing, we made a commitment of investing $3 to $5 million over 5 to 10 years in affordable housing. And we had hoped that our dollars would be catalytic. We didn't know where the other dollars would come from. We were fortunate that early on, we were the beneficiaries of NSP funds to enable the work. But what we've seen over the course of time is that there are many, oftentimes, other collaborators or prospective collaborators that share a very similar vision, maybe from a different angle. So our focus was the intersection of health and housing, and how can we improve the health of our pediatric patients, their families, by improving the built environment. We then started to learn that financial institutions are looking at how can they impact low to moderate income communities through their CRA, Community Reinvestment Act commitments that need to be made. Our local philanthropic community was looking at how do we start to focus where our mayor was focused, which were on 3 key neighborhoods that had been underserved for quite some time in the city of Columbus and had a number of challenges. And so the philanthropic community was looking at how can they be a support. And so we started to have these conversations with these folks who are now our collaborators and part of our network in investing in housing. And we easily identified that we have a common denominator. We're talking about the same things from different sectors, but we're all looking for outcomes that are similar, which is economic impact in improved communities and improved health and public good. And so over time, we've been able to layer dollars to enable the affordable housing work. The home ownership model, when we started looking at vacant blighted properties and also new build construction on vacant lots, because our land bank received federal dollars to do demolition. We never want to go in and propose demolition in our neighborhood. It is not an area of interest for our community residents. They really want to see housing preservation. We want to be proponents of their vision of what housing should look like in their neighborhood. We feel like it's our neighborhood as well, but we certainly respect the families who have helped kind of serve as that anchor in the community, that have stayed during the tough times, been there during the good and bad. And so we were able to pull in dollars to focus on home ownership. When we did this pivot, still doing home ownership as a model, but really emphasizing and focusing on rental because of the local need in our community, we realized that we needed to be very creative because the rental model, it requires us to now be a landlord. And so we have a LLC that has been developed in partnership with our Community Development Corporation partner that focuses solely on housing. And through that LLC, we've been able to blend funds at a below market rate with our financial institution partners, with the philanthropic community, and also with the hospital serving as a guarantor for what is now a loan fund to enable our work. And this has been a game changer because it's allowed us to accelerate our work. So we've been able to expand the number of housing units that we can bring online. You know, when we started doing affordable rental, we had, just based on the structure of the financing, we were able to lease these units to families who earn up to 80% of area median income. And so we thought that those were the families that we were going to touch, families who are right around hovering at 80% of AMI and were in need of below market rate housing. And what we've realized is that our portfolio consists mostly of families holding housing vouchers who are at 40% of area median income. And this is the population that's hardest to serve because it's not just about housing. You know, we've gone in, we've gotten to learn the needs of our tenants. We have a property management company that works alongside of us, but this is the really hard work. And you know, Richard's going into the communities that are hardest to serve. Affordable housing is probably some of the toughest housing to build when you look at the housing sector, because you're not just starting with the housing, you're starting with the families and understanding what their needs are. And so making sure that we're having those conversations with our tenants to not only show them what tenant success looks like from the aspect of how to maintain your unit, but also sharing information with them on here are workforce training opportunities, here's how we're partnering with the schools, here's what we're doing in terms of neighborhood leadership academies if you want to get involved in your civic community and truly be a part of the community, because any of you who've sat in civic association meetings, you hear a lot from the homeowners, and the renters are almost like this invisible population. And that's not what we want. We want to empower families who are part of the work that we're doing. And so capital stacks have truly been success for us to be able to go deeper in affordable housing work.
And your model is very different. You're serving a different population. In some ways, it's limited in scope in that you know how many teachers you have and that you need. I'm curious, you know, how you make the financing work if you feel like with what you are able to do now, you are meeting kind of the full scope of what you as an employer need for success with your strategy. And then also, I can't help but ask, are any other employers in the area who might have trouble with exactly the same issue you do talking to you about this?
Sure. So I always get a little leery of talking to a group, knowing that you know, we got $15 million of voter approved, $50 million in voter approved funds to start a housing program that's free and clear of debt service. So right there, we have a leg up. So I totally get that. But what that allowed us to do was really start with, let's back into rents with affordability in mind. You know, we're not having to focus on a pro forma that hits a certain financial target. And so, and the other complicated part about where we live is we're in 3 different towns, 3 different counties. So there isn't a blanket AMI model that we could apply towards our program. So we actually created our own, our teacher median income using our own salary schedule and basically created a very similar program that you see with AMI models, different tiers, different categories, and different associated rent amounts. But the unique part about that was we were able to focus on making sure that we were starting with affordability in mind. And when we went out to our voting communities, we promised, and it's actually part of the ballot language, that excess dollars that our housing program generates after we pay for property management, after we pay for operating expenses, HOA fees, you name it, gets reinvested back into the program. And so we're spending dollars back into the program to develop it. We've only had the program fully occupied for a little over a year, about 1 year and 5 months. So we're still figuring out what's next. But we have a leg up knowing that we have dollars to reinvest back into the program once we figure out and try to get clarity on what that should be. Another project that we're working on too is a partnership with our local Habitat for Humanity chapter, where the school district donated $3 million worth of land. And back to partners that you know, maybe unknown partners out there. One of our local counties came to the table to contribute $3.2 million to infrastructure. And so right out of the gate, the school district was able to essentially create, it's 27 units of for purchase housing. 14 of them are for the school district, 13 of them are for the county. Again, with no capital commitment other than a lot of legal fees to try to figure all of this out. And we're building net zero homes, which is another really cool component and in regards to maintaining affordability for staff. But again, a unique approach that didn't require, minus the one-time voter-approved $15 million, school districts are generally cash-strapped. And so what were creative solutions we could come up with to try to figure this out? And I think those were two examples of how we did that.
And are other employers curious in this model?
Very curious. Again, the $15 million of voter-approved funds is kind of a conversation stopper a lot of times. But the collaborative nature of partnerships and certainly understanding how do we balance the issues that come up with running a program as maybe private employers or even other public sector employers are looking at starting something and just trying to hear the story and learn from what we've done.
What are some of those key issues about being an employer and landlord? Is that weird?
Right. Well, I'm going to have to start calling it a housing provider now. So it sounds so much better. That was part of the risk that we knew. So how do we handle both of those? Because that becomes a very personal and sticky situation when maybe things aren't going so well. And so I think similar to you, we have a layer of property management in between us and our staff members in our housing units. And then the list of lessons learned is too long to go through here today. But I know that if we could go back and do things differently, we certainly would. But I think creating insulation between us and our staff in their homes and their private life was a key one.
Yeah, thank you. Richard, talking a little bit more about the relationship, I mean, you're running a business and you're also deeply focused, everything is organized on the success of the residents. Can you talk a little bit about how the financial stability, security, mobility of your residents in turn can benefit the business?
Well, I think it's fairly obvious. I mean, we are dealing with the low-income tax credit program in most all of the communities in which we work, and as well as with philanthropy, which is just the key to anything that we have done. I often say that I don't know that we've ever gone into a project that was financially feasible. And it's one of the hallmarks of McCormick Barron. We just have to work the problem backwards. We take a look at what the rental income is, what we can support in debt, what kind of support we might get from the local community, the city, and then we have a gap always, and then we have to go figure out how to raise it. But the obvious benefits to investors is the stability of the community. If they're buying tax credits, they're in the program for 15 years. And the fact that these communities are thriving, that the residents are doing well, they stay fully occupied, is a very important thing for the investors. And developing a relationship with them. And of course, in most places, we're dealing with financial institutions that have CRA requirements, who are in the marketplace. And giving them the security that they're making a good investment is very important. And so that is part of what we are interested in doing. Obviously, the more stability we can create in the communities, the less turnover we have in these communities, the less operating costs that we have, gives us the ability to generate more cash flow. And to the extent that those investors are participating in that, it just makes it a better economic investment for them. So it is not often an easy story to tell when you're talking to financial institutions about the kind of human capital programs that we're operating. But in many cases where they have come in and bought the credits, most of these institutions have foundations. And suddenly we have a better source of supporting the nonprofit and the residents in terms of these human capital programs. And I must say that over the years, as some of the older bankers have retired and we've got new, younger people that are in these positions in financial institutions who have a much more enlightened view of rebuilding community and in terms of markets in which they're located, it makes it a lot easier for us to go in and have an intelligent conversation about the importance of linking shelter with healthy outcomes, looking at neighborhood stability, working with the cities to try to reduce the crime in these neighborhoods. And it was interesting, I was in a meeting last week in Cleveland, and we're working there in a neighborhood across from the Cleveland Clinic. And the CFO of the Cleveland Clinic, who's been there for about a year, they put a new building on the edge of the clinic in this neighborhood in which we're working. And he said, you know, we have to rebuild this neighborhood. He said, you know, I'm replacing glass panels in this office building about every 3 weeks. And he says, we're spending a fortune just keeping this building secure because they're just drive-bys and, you know, guys are just shooting out the glass. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, we got to rebuild this whole neighborhood as fast as we can finally go. I've been talking to the Cleveland Clinic for 25 years. That's how long we've been in Cleveland. It was like, where did this guy come from? Well, you know where he came from? You won't even believe this. The Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund. And the Cleveland Clinic has got a major installation in Abu Dhabi. And they recruited this guy to come to Cleveland. And he's sitting looking at what's going on with his operating costs. And he says, can't you do more? I said, sure. You got some more money? We can do more. So that's essentially what happens. And, you know, you have to be able to deal with that kind of situation. And it's hard to, I mean, you know, we have a lot of folks on our staff who have fire in their belly. They're all like this group who are interested in affordable housing and trying to repurpose underserved communities. And being able to navigate between the financial institutions and the politics in the local community and the neighborhood organizations and you know, be able to handle all of that with all those pressures is a very, very interesting thing. And to some extent, it's part of why I love what we do. Because, you know, it just is, over time, you develop a facility for working with folks. But once you're able to really navigate in a community and work with residents, with the tenant rights groups and the others, you know, as one of my public housing leaders said to me many years ago, and she's since passed away, she said, Barron, you know, let me tell you something about your business. She said, you got all these smart people with MBAs and degrees and lawyers, he says, you know, but what you need are a lot of people that have mother wit. And she said, they don't train that in graduate school. And I said, you know, I know. And I think one of the real unfortunate things for graduate education these days is that, you know, I went into legal services and spent the next 4 years in public housing communities all over the United States. And you develop a facility for talking honestly with people. And I think those opportunities don't exist quite as much today as they once did. And it's unfortunate because you really have to learn how to navigate at all levels in this kind of process in order to get stuff done, forgetting for the moment the lack of interest in the federal government and state government in providing the resources that you need. But ultimately, to implement, you got to be able to do that in a multifaceted way.
All right. Well, I think we're going to invite the mayor up and then open it up to all of you. So I hope you've been thinking about your questions for these four.
We're supposed
We'll
to
all
move
just,
somewhere.
we will scoot a little bit. I'll try to not topple off the edge here. So we have some mic runners, I believe. Could y'all identify yourselves? Did we just lose our mic runners? Oh, I see them assembling at the door. Thank you. Okay, we've got our mic runners here, so you can just raise your hand, and one of them will come to you. And then, right before you ask your question, please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Molly with NeighborWorks America. We have about 250 organizations across the country who are trying to navigate this space between doing community development, doing it sustainably, financially, and also improving individuals' lives. Could you all talk about any of the ways that you are able to show and demonstrate the impact that all of these projects have had on individuals' lives? If it's financial, if it's other health metrics, how are you telling the individual impact story?
Well, I can respond for, I mentioned urban strategies. We have developed a set of metrics that we use in every community in which we work. And so we're measuring health outcomes, we're measuring the performance of the children in school, and we're looking at family incomes, and particularly the head of household, so that we can work it over time. The important ingredient in these projects that we're doing are case managers who are working one-on-one with the families. And the outcomes have been exceptional. And it really is what's required if you're going to try to change the quality of life for the families and children in these communities. And so for us, housing has always been a platform. Once we can stabilize a family and keep it from leaving and moving around, as the mayor described his own experiences, so that the elementary school teachers have a kid who starts in September who finishes in May or June, and have a chance to get with these children over a whole school year. Once we stabilize their shelter, then we can intervene in a lot of different ways. We can help the heads of household get to better places in terms of wages and employment, and the children as well, and summer programming, getting them actively involved with other kinds of things during the summer. And you know, I often kid about the fact that I've got more minor league baseball teams on our sites than any other Major League Baseball owner. But those are the things that we do. And I, early on with our team at Urban Strategy, said, listen, this anecdotal stuff is just not going to cut it with foundations and funders and the government. We have got to have measurements of outcomes to really track and see what's going on here. And if we're weak in certain places, then we need to do better. I'll give you one specific example, and then I'll be quiet because these folks are a lot brighter than I am. We're working in Galveston, Texas. We went in after Hurricane Ike and have built a couple of new communities there. And one of our strategies, regional people at one of our board meetings said, you know, we've just gotten back our results on testing for state tests. Not that those are necessarily indicative of much of anything, but the problem is that the African-American kids living in our housing now are doing a lot less well on these tests than the Hispanic kids and the white kids. And we really got to intervene and do something with these kids. So we were fortunate. We got a foundation grant for an educational coordinator to literally be in these communities now, working with these kids after school and on the weekends. And we're starting to see movement right away. And so that's the granular part of this kind of work in terms of trying to respond to your question. And you just can't get by with talk about policy and, you know, good intentions. It really is just day-to-day working with families and children. And we've seen extraordinary outcomes in the communities in which we've been active.
Other thoughts? I know we talked about this a little bit on our call.
Sure. So at Nationwide Children's, we have 5 prongs of our neighborhood initiative. So it's affordable housing, education, health and wellness, workforce development, and community enrichment. And we've set up a series of metrics for each of those 5 prongs. So we're looking at what are the outcomes across the spectrum for the work that we're trying to do in the neighborhood and within that investment footprint. And so in terms of affordable housing, we've now incorporated a housing goal within our strategic plan for the organization. So we're looking at how many homes can we bring back online, how many of those vacant blighted properties can we touch in the neighborhood, bring them back online, generate taxes and revenue, and the income rather, because we do this at a loss. There's always a development gap that we experience and that we have to offset in the home ownership space. But so we have hardcore metrics based on number of units. And the other prongs are really what I enjoy seeing those metrics established for, because we know that housing, it's not just about the bricks and mortar. We're really talking about the human impact that this housing provides in our community. And so we're looking at how are we shaping outcomes in our education prong? What are we doing as it relates to the number of families that we're touching by way of education? And just to give you an example of what that looks like, our hospital has an education office. And so through that office, we have a pre-K literacy program that we implement that's part of a larger citywide initiative. We've identified the zip codes that we are doing our housing investment in as the areas where we want to go in and do early pre-K literacy for families who do not have children who are pre-kindergarten enrolled in a curriculum-based program. So we have a group of caseworkers who go out, and it's a 12-month program. They work with that child and most importantly with the guardian or the parents to make sure that they are setting a curriculum in place that that parent or guardian can continue throughout the course of the year. They meet monthly, and they're setting that path for the child, for this particular child or for these children to be kindergarten ready, which is a major issue in the city of Columbus, making sure that we have students or young kids who are within our Columbus City School District who are kindergarten ready. So we have a metric there where we're looking at that pre and post outcome. We're also measuring workforce training and development, and how are we using that prong to create this pipeline of employment opportunities for the hospital. You know, there's certainly self-enlightened interest in all of the work that we do, and then there's that social impact and social responsibility of what we do. And you know, one area where we benefit is if we can bring families in and stabilize housing, we can also start to create a future workforce for the hospital, and we can stabilize those families and also give greater proximity to where they work and where they live. That helps with retention. It reduces turnover, which comes at a cost to the organization. So we're looking at how many residents neighborhood-wide are we employing on an annual basis at Nationwide Children's. Certainly the health outcomes, which are the cornerstone of our work, are what matter most to us. And so we're starting to measure what are the outcomes in emergency department visits. What are we seeing in terms of reduction? Are we seeing a reduction in ED visits? And the answer is yes, we're starting to see those reductions, particularly as it relates to asthma visits, which we know housing, lead, exposure to mold, mildew, all impacts health of young children. And so we're hoping that those numbers continue to increase. You know, one of the things that we talk about in healthcare when we start to talk about metrics and looking at social determinants of health, healthcare is very evidence-based. We live by metrics. This is an area that's a little more gray. And so we're all being very patient. We talk to our peers at other healthcare organizations to see what are you using as metrics, what are you seeing as outcomes. And I think it's been universally agreed to that the outcomes and the metrics for social determinants of health, they require a longer time span to really see how we're improving communities. And we know that anecdotal data is not the only data that we have to use. We are talking about foundation dollars to keep this work going, boards who need to support our work. Our hospital board has been incredibly supportive, but those metrics really do matter. So our research team over at the hospital is the group that focuses on that area for us.
Okay.
Thank you. And I had wanted to ask that earlier, so thank you.
Hi, Jeff Faulkner from the National Foundation for Credit Counseling. You know, the work you guys are doing on building the inventory and knocking down barriers to access is great. We're now in a situation where we're seeing unprecedented levels of unsecured debt in this country. If you add up credit cards, student debt, fintech debt, healthcare debt, et cetera, it's over $3 trillion now and growing rapidly. That's got to be impacting what you do, how you define affordable in your housing, I'm assuming, or what is the interplay you're seeing with that, especially in what Mayor Lucas talked about with the wage stagnation. How is all this very large unsecured debt impacting your work and how you're defining your work?
Go ahead, Mary.
Well, in some ways, it's kind of an interesting question for housing providers. And frankly, it's a suggestion that we have to be cooperative with them you can't part of our Tenants Bill of Rights has actually spoken to the credit check and application process and credit worthiness of renters. And what it's requiring those of us to do who work in this space is to say, well, understanding that there might be folks that either have not established credit or have enough credit incidents, deleterious credit incidents in their past to be a barrier to renting, is there some way that we can further establish relationships that suggest that they will be a good renter? The school district provides such an opportunity, and we've done more work saying, can we create opportunities for certain labor sector areas? Teachers from the school district, city employees, in a way making sure that those are in essence pseudo guarantees, understanding that there is actually that credit issue. And so much of what we've tried to do on the creation side is to say, how do we create, frankly, networks of folks that do have some way that we can find a credit substitute, in essence, to still create good housing opportunities for them? How can we create a pathway for those who have consistent and stable employment so that that in some way becomes a substitute? But there is an incredible challenge area and a gap that we have not thought of yet. The person who does not have employment, the person who does not have established credit, but still needs housing. And frankly, that is us trying to, in a way, with our own public housing authority. I actually met with HUD yesterday. Must have known I was coming here. And frankly, look at it more reform of our housing authority, some of the work that you've been doing for decades. In the voucher provision programs, is there a way that for those folks we can build up a better pathway to establish credit, a better pathway that actually makes up for some of those perhaps other mistakes that are impacting their life choices?
Jenny Schutz with Brookings. I want to follow up with Mayor Lucas on that point. So Richard talked about the declining levels of federal funding going to cities, going to housing assistance, but we've also changed how federal funding is spent. So there are a lot fewer public housing units than there used to be. You know, the emphasis has been more on vouchers, on LIHTC, so indirectly. Pretend that you got a whole bunch more money from the federal government. How would you want it to come? In hard public housing units, more vouchers, in something like CDBG or UDAG that's a flexible block grant that you can use. If you got to pick, what would you want?
You know, I continue to believe in public housing units, and I think there is an important role they play in the market. I've greatly appreciated mixed income development. Some of the most successful programs our city has done relate to the Choice Neighborhood program from HUD, which has allowed us, frankly, to do a lot of what McCormick Barron has been doing for years, just from the public housing space. Building communities that have a diversity in income, usually have wraparound services, which we found to be key, and creating some consistent relationships and frankly consistent renters. So that's one area I'd like to see us address. Another is actually if we could create, and HUD has a program by the name of the RAD program, and it relates to our ability to actually, I think, do more work in preservation in single family development. I think that's actually that next big question area. If you look at the financial crisis, the mortgage crisis, et cetera, right, lots of that did relate to mortgages on single family homes. And frankly, you're seeing a lot of that impact, not just cities, but first ring suburbs, lots of communities in our country. We'll need to find a way to, I think, end the white flight and middle class black flight that you've seen in so many communities that has really led to leapfrog development and ex-urban development in every market of America. I think our next big question will be, how do we rebuild those inner ring suburbs? How do we rebuild subdivisions built in the 50s, 60s, 70s? And that's where I think more work will be, and we'll need more resources long term.
Yeah, I think that the important thing that happened in early 90s with the Hope 6 program is that we created a way to bring private capital into the creation of public housing. And the thing that has been, at least our experience with the Hope 6 program and now with Choice Neighborhoods, is that we are able to house very low income families who have a right of first return. And the thing that I just described earlier, Once we get those families with a case manager, a lot of them who have credit issues and who have difficulty because they've gotten themselves into all kinds of payday loans and other things. And we can get them with a case manager to work out a financial plan. We can get them into job training programs. We can get them reoriented into the workforce. It makes a huge difference. And the key are having the resources to be able to do the human capital services with the hard development, combining those two things. That can be done on a neighborhood level. It can be done in single-family neighborhoods that got a lot of abandonment. There can be a central office for the ownership where you have people working alongside of the families and their kids in those neighborhoods to reestablish them. My sense is and the mayor is now getting into this in a very real way, which is terrific. The more flexible dollars that can come out of Washington for city government to use in a variety of different ways. As they're stabilizing those subdivisions, they're working on retail services at the same time. They're encouraging minority ownership and entrepreneurship. And having the flexibility of dollars is really the key. You know, as I was saying to somebody earlier, the idea that we're now in 2020 and the housing programs of America are run out of the Treasury Department is preposterous. And it is, I mean, we have become so completely off the mark now in terms of dealing with housing and urban development. I mean, the Kerner report came out in the 60s. You read it today and it's like reading your report here. Yeah, it's the same thing. I mean, nothing has changed, except it's gotten worse. And there just hasn't been the real commitment. And hopefully there'll be a change in Washington to a point where people begin to start to redeploy dollars. One of the places where there's a lot of money trapped that's caused a lot of this problem is over these state departments of transportation that built the interstates and spread them out into the suburbs and put the off-ramps into the home builders could put up a new subdivision. And that money has to be redeployed completely back into the cities in a way that mayors can take those dollars and do the streets, do the infrastructure, do the lighting, do all the other kinds of things that need to be done. And if we could get some enlightened leadership along those lines, I think we've got, obviously the country's got the resources to do this. That's never been the issue. There's just been no interest, particularly. And it's just gotten to a point now where it's become so bad that if we can see a change in the Congress and in the White House, that there'll be some real focus on some of this kind of thing, the things will get better. There's no question about it. The reality of it is we know what to do today that we didn't know 40 years ago in terms of intervention into these underserved areas of the country. The problem is the lack of resources, either on the state levels or not.
I'm going to stop us there and say I love your last line, and I want us to leave on that. People, there's a lot of ideas. We know a lot. These people are doing so much. My takeaway from all of this today is housing is an everyone problem, and everyone can do something about it. All of these folks from their different vantage points and so much more that we hopefully will be hearing from you all. That's my call to action from everybody here as I close out and give a huge thank you to our audience and to our speakers. So let's give them another round of applause. And Stacy, thank you. And a huge thank you to you all for being here and to EPIC's funders for making this possible and folks like Jenny and the rest of our advisory group. So we are now, as Catherine said and as Ida said, transitioning in our EPIC process with the release of this document about what's going on to what can everybody be doing it? What can leaders in all sectors be doing to make a real difference on the issues that we've worked to diagnose and that others have obviously also known about and that we learned from as we were doing this. So our call to action is please reach out to us. I know that the slide is not up right now about how to reach out to us, but you can reach out to us through Emmy Urban, whose email address was on the page for this, or you can find our email addresses online. Tell us, what is your favorite solution? What do you want to make sure that we consider and that we know about when we're putting together this solutions framework? So with that, let's move on to the cocktails, and you can ask these people more questions. And thanks so much, those of you online. I'm sorry we can't offer you cocktails, but we'll close it there. Thank you so much. Thank you.